Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Bo Winegard. Bo Winegard is a social psychologist and executive editor of Aporia Magazine. Bo, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And it just a point of clarification, is it Aporia? Like, how do you stress the A?
I'm a bit of a Philistine about pronunciation, so I say Aporia basically, but
Okay.
maybe Aporia is better. I don't know.
Well, I think Aporia comes more naturally, but
Yeah,
Aporia is like,
you're right. It
you know,
does.
the
Yeah.
literal word. Okay, so you are working with Aporia now,
Yes.
and previously when we spoke, which was a couple of years ago on Agora Politics,
Hmm.
Agora Politics, you were a then canceled academic who had sort of been exiled for some of your research interests
Yes.
and kind of kicked out of the small, was it a university or a college?
Yeah. College, small
Yeah, where
college.
you were
Yeah.
teaching at.
Yes.
And so I guess before we get into everything that's going on with Aporia, and we're definitely going to cover a lot of that because I think that's the most interesting thing
Hmm.
that you've been working on recently, is can we just give people a little bit of overview of sort of where you are now, retrospectively, upon being forcibly removed from academia and
Sure.
just your reflections on that whole ordeal.
Yeah, so for people who don't know, I mean, essentially it was my interest in human variation and more specifically my candid assessment of the evidence on race and IQ, which led to my termination. Although there were other, details here and there, not worth getting into anyway. But it was, I mean, I can't say unequivocally that's exactly what did it, but I'm 95% certain. So after termination, I bounced around a lot. I did a lot of reading, which I already was doing, but I took the time that I wasn't teaching to do to do more reading. um I edited for Quillette for a while,
Yep.
and I wrote articles where I could. Of course, I'm not going to write a mainstream article. I'm too toxic. New York Times would have to retract the second it published it when it got mobbed, especially after the. I mean, it seems so long ago now, but the Floyd situation and what was that, summer of 2020? I suppose things got.
Well, Steve Saylor's still talking about it, the ramifications.
Yes, he is, and I think that, I mean, I think for good reason, because that
Mhm.
that was I mean, it was already getting worse. I think I think I agree with Saylor in that I would put the rise of what we've called the Great Awakening more in like the 2012-13 area, but
Mhm.
certainly it accelerated rapidly after the Floyd situation. So anyway, yeah, things got worse. So I'm never going to write for a mainstream outlet, and I never try. But I did jobs here and there, focused on research. Um, I'm writing books on the side, but I won't really talk about those because I'm always worried that I'll tarry and not get them done, and then people will be like, "Hey, why didn't you do that book?" So
Right,
just say
right.
I'm doing works on the side, but now my main focus is on, and I'll go with the Aporia. My main focus is on Aporia, editing, writing, and doing podcasts, and really focusing on some research for some longer pieces I would like to do. I mean, I've already done a piece that was, I think it was a 7,000 word piece on race realism, which took me a long time. I mean, obviously, I know a lot of this stuff, but you always have to refresh your memory. And
Mhm.
I hadn't been reading about race that specifically for a year or so. So I had to really immerse myself back in that literature to write that article, which I'm really proud of. I like that article. So I'm working on a couple more of those kinds of articles, like on immigration and demographic change, for example. And that's what I spend my time doing, 12, 14 hours a day. Getting fired didn't change that. I continued to work like that because that's what I love to do. The
Yeah.
only thing that really was, like upsetting and quite well, there are many things that are quite lamentable about getting fired, but The only thing that really, really injured me was I missed teaching. I love teaching. It was one of the more exhilarating things I could do. It gives you this kind of immediate feedback that you don't get from writing,
Yeah.
because writing, you put it out there. I don't know, maybe some people tweet it and you're like, oh, cool, some people are looking at it. But teaching, you get, you tell a joke, somebody laughs right away.
Mm.
So I do miss that. But anyway, life goes on. Now, I should say, and this is something I often like to add to this, is that I was lucky in that I was in a situation in which I could afford to take some risks, which is why I did. I felt it was my duty and my position to take risks that maybe other people who were just starting a family or had kids, they didn't have another person's income to rely on if they needed to. I mean, one never wants to rely on another person's income, but I knew I was in a position in which I could take more risks, and so I did. Now, I didn't think I would get fired. I did, but I think that's important because I understand, I know a lot of people who talk to me privately and they say, look, like, I just had my second kid. Like, should I be honest about this? And I actually urge caution to those people still.
Mm. So, I guess briefly, allow me some digression
Sure.
on this point. You mentioned some of the things that you got canceled for,
Mm-hmm.
what's been called like race realism, or in
Yes.
other areas of like the
Hereditarianism.
hereditarianism,
Yeah.
human biodiversity. These
Right.
are all roughly synonyms for the same kind of thing, which is basically
Mm-hmm.
just observing that human populations on aggregate differ on very important traits, among
Right.
them IQ.
Yes.
And now I will just say as like a baseline starting point, because I still talk to people, even friends of mine, who
Mm-hmm.
will say things like, Alex, why do you care about this? Right?
Right.
Why does it matter to you?
Yes.
Even if these differences exist, even if they may or may not be real, this is sort of the thing they say to me. Um, why would you risk any amount of your professional or personal reputation,
Mm-hmm.
potential job opportunities, etc., putting yourself on the line to talk about these differences? Because, isn't it just better if we sweep them under the rug and don't
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge that they exist?
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I would say before we get into like, and by the way, for those listening, I don't want to take the time in this particular interview, just because we are short on time, to go through the entire argument for like the evidence,
Sure.
for this theory, and whether it's true, and all that
Right.
other stuff. Let's just take it as a point of fact that it's true, that important characteristics differ between groups of human populations when they're clustered together, um, and that among them is intelligence, the best measure of intelligence we have being IQ. Um, why is it that this is something worth talking about? Because that is often the objection that people
Right.
revert to.
It's a great question. Let me just say, I agree with you. We would need like 4 hours to cover the evidence and address all of like the commonly forwarded arguments against the claims that I'm going to make right now. However, if we just take like sort of the minimalist position, which is that there are in fact uh, differences in traits such as IQ right now between populations in the United States. Let's stick to that circumscribed claim because that's what I'm going to talk
Yeah,
about
you're saying
here.
regardless of putting anything
Regardless
forward
of
about the
causes.
hereditary nature of them.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's like, forget about etiology. Do we have these differences? And the point that I want to stress is the existence of the differences is not in fact controversial in the literature. So for example, if you pick up either McIntosh or Earl Hunt's, those are the two most popular textbooks on intelligence, both of them will say, without much fuss, there are large differences. This is just a fact. We find these over and over since we first started testing intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I would say. We can just accept that. Then, of course, complicated debates about what causes that, and we're not going to get into that.
Yeah.
The question you asked is why talk about that? I think I have two answers to it. One answer is sheer curiosity, especially because I'm interested in human evolution and human nature. And I don't think you can understand it. You can't understand human evolution completely or human nature completely unless you understand variation. I mean, variation is basically, it's one of the underlying premises of evolution, right? You need variation and differential selection. Now, it turns out that individuals vary, and that's interesting.
Yes.
Sexes vary, and that's also interesting. And human populations or subspecies in different organisms vary, and that's also varieties, whatever you want to call them. I mean, pick your nomenclature. They vary, and that is interesting. So merely as like a passionate, I don't want to sound pompous and call myself a scientist, but explorer of the world, I find that fascinating. I think the more important and sort of the more politically germane argument would be, I believe that in the absence of addressing these differences, that creates a lacuna. And in that lacuna, the woke narrative rises and spreads because you have no way to reject the woke narrative that all, or roughly all, social disparities, outcome disparities, income, status, job, academic distributions, whatever, that these are caused by racism. Like, that's essentially the woke narrative. And you hear Kendi say this, rather nakedly, right? I mean, he just asserts, if we have a race disparity, essentially we can assume, maybe he would say it's a heuristic, but we can assume that racism caused it. Right. I think that is a divisive, incendiary narrative that undermines important institutions in the West and creates racial animosity, by the way. And I determined at some point around, let's say, 2018, that being honest about this issue and putting it into the mainstream was better than constantly surrendering territory to progressives. I mean, like, if you look at what conservative, in my view, the conservative response to this is it's impotent and embarrassing. Like, if you go to the National Review, it's essentially everything's always culture.
Yeah. They always want to talk about culture.
Father absence, whatever. Yeah.
I'm half Ashkenazi Jewish, right?
Okay.
And this means that I come out on sort of like the winning side of this discussion, right? Because as a group, Jews do have one of the highest, if not the highest, average IQ. Yeah. And I will encounter other Jews, for example, on Clubhouse, who will say, yes, it's true that Jews are so successful because we're really smart. But the reason we're smart is just because we study more. Like, just because we care more about school. Right. And I'm just like, look, this is so ridiculous.
I know.
As to be like absurd. Like, if it was true that there's some sort of secret Jewish education program that you could go to and make your IQ, let's say, 10 points higher, than the average is 100. Jews have anywhere between like 107 to like 112, depending on who's measuring. Then you would want that education to be rolled out for like the entire world. You would want that rolled out everywhere, because it would be an amazing discovery that you can get people to be like almost a standard deviation smarter. But it turns out you can't.
It's also baffling, like, from this view, for whatever reason, let's just take blacks for this example. Oh no, let's take white Gentiles, because
let's take a less divisive group.
Exactly. So let's take white Gentiles. So from this perspective, white Gentiles bafflingly reject this educational program that would boost our IQs by nearly a standard deviation. Right. It's really nonsensical when you think about it. I mean, it's incredibly implausible. But in this case, I mean, I think it can be a source of levity. It's kind of funny that people, in other cases, it's unfortunately not so funny, because it does lead to these very divisive and ruinous beliefs, and this sort of like perpetual rancor between the races. Because if you're telling a group that the reason that you're disproportionately underrepresented, it's not because of like intrinsic traits or natural distributions. It's because there's this group of people who invidiously discriminates against you, has these untrue but hateful stereotypes, and
Yeah.
propagates those into the world. I mean,
And they're
that's
literally acting to dumb you down. That's the
yes.
conclusion of the belief.
Their argument is literally that white people have somehow worked together to suppress by a standard deviation the IQ of another group.
Mhm.
Now, if that were true, of course, I would say that would be awful and that we should attempt to rectify it. Since it's not true, it's directing antipathy toward a group of people who do not deserve it. And I that's what I think. I get this question a lot. The question you said people ask you, why do you care about this? Sometimes people will say, why are you obsessed about this? Which, one, if you looked at my actual reading habits, I'm not obsessed with it. I would honestly rather read Shakespeare than a book on race and IQ. I can promise you that. However, I am obsessed with the issue publicly because I hate prevaricating, dishonesty, and especially I hate the hypocrisy around this topic.
Yeah.
I think that it's loathsome, and I think intellectuals are pusillanimous, that they're cowardly, and it would be better if people were just more candid about this.
Yeah. I mean, so my version of the answer to this question, the TLDR, is like, okay, obviously it's divisive, it's culturally toxic.
Right.
But my version of the TLDR of this is like, look, if you're designing social policy around something that is just not true,
Right.
then you're just going to end up expending a tremendous amount of effort in a very counterproductive way.
Yes.
And so at the very least, if you actually cared about equity, if you actually cared, and I'm not saying that that's like something that we uphold here at the Hacking State podcast, but I'm saying if I take the side of my ideological opponents and I say, this is what I actually care about, then you would take it very seriously.
Yes, I agree.
Because it would mean that like you are basing a lot of your decisions off of a false premise.
Yes.
And so you should stop doing that.
Yes.
That being said, I think we are going to stick a pin in this point and sort of move on to the next thing. Absolutely. I just wanted to get that out of the way because it comes up so often that I have to like acknowledge it.
Can I just say one thing on that though? I do just want to say that I understand people's concerns about it, and I understand that it can seem almost unseemly. I do understand that, but I hope what people will see, and this is why I work incredibly diligently to model this in my discourse. I don't think it's something to take lightly. So I don't want to make invidious jokes or divisive comments or degrade anybody. I do think that's important. I think it's important to come at this from a place of desiring the truth. Now, look, my political views are obviously out of the mainstream, and that's fine, but I think we can do this with a sense of responsibility and politeness. And I do try to model that in my writing and my public behavior.
Right. So you don't need to lose respectability on either side.
Right.
Necessarily. I mean, we can have disagreements about the value of respectability, but
we can have disagreements about everything respectively.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Right.
All right. So let's move on to then your newest venture, which is Aporia.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about kind of the backstory of how you came to be the executive editor, and maybe just some details, fill in for the listeners what Aporia is about. It's sort of a new Substack magazine. It's focused on sort of heterodox social science. What exactly does that mean? Who are the writers that Aporia is sort of courting, whose voices or even just avenues of thought are sort of not being recognized in mainstream academic literature? Let's get into that. So for starters, how did you get involved in Aporia?
I'll make the sort of what I consider the boring biographical details short. I mean, I was on a podcast called Ideas Sleep Furiously, which is what became Aporia.
Yeah.
And
okay.
Yeah. So the host and I, Matt and I, had a wonderful, sprawling, almost 3-hour conversation, I think. And then we stayed in touch. I didn't even know him before that. That was the first time I met him. I don't recall exactly how we stayed in touch, but we would message, from time to time after that. And then at some point, I guess like he figured out that he was going to move in this direction more seriously and start it as like more of an official magazine. And he offered me the gig. At the time, I was doing editing work for Quillette, and I was always like, I want to be a diligent and fair employee. So I was careful to talk to them and to, just test out the future, see what was happening. And then I made a decision that ideas sleep furiously, because we weren't Aporia yet. That would be best for my future, because I had interests that I knew I wouldn't be able to pursue elsewhere, namely the race stuff. We're inevitably we'll have to talk about that a little bit for Aporia, but we won't have to get into too many of the details. But anyway, so I had these interests, immigration, etc. I wanted to write about these things, and I just have these certain intellectual values that I think I would be allowed to flourish at this magazine. And Matt and I got along quite well. So I decided to join. Then we changed our name for various reasons. I mean, ideas sleep furiously. It comes from a Chomsky sentence, which is, it's a funny sentence, but a lot of people would be like, what the heck's ideas sleep furiously?
Green
maybe
ideas sleep furiously.
Yeah, colorless green ideas sleep furiously was his sentence, right? So it's a bit of an obscure reference. So we changed the name, and I just think Aporia sounds cooler. It's kind of like, it's a riddle, it's a confession of Tao. It's sort of interesting. It sounds Greek and sort of elevated, I suppose. But about the more important topic, which is what are we doing? So I think Matt would give you a different answer, and we just hired Noah Carl, which I'm excited about, because I'm a huge fan of Noah, and he also exemplifies all of the values that I think are important, namely a humility, but a candor, a willingness to follow the evidence where it leads, and though always fair-mindedness, charitableness, and cordiality. So we have Noah Carl now. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit of a diversion. My answer would be a little bit different, but here would be my answer. I see what I was talking about before, this sort of niche that is more or less empty, and that is talking, writing about human variation specifically, and like other issues that are related to human variation, although they may not have to directly address human variation. For example, crime, intelligence, immigration, demographic change, nationalism. These are all topics about which I am interested, but I don't want to be tendentious or dogmatic about them. I want to have, vehement but respectful debate about these issues, and to write about them respectfully. And that's what I'm trying to do with Aporia. And if you look at my output, you can see that I think that's what I'm doing right now. I've written about human variation a number of times, but I've also written about everything from empathy to nationalism to diversity, and is diversity actually good?
Is diversity even a value?
Yeah, exactly. Is it a value? Should it be a value? What does that even mean? Is like it
the measure of heterogeneity in a system?
Yeah, is that like a good thing?
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Well, I have my answer on that. Obviously, is that issue actually. I get kind of worked up about that one, because I just think it's a lie and a scam, and I think we should be more blunt about that one. But I'll set that aside for a moment. So anyway, that's what I try to do there. And I do see, I just think there's this, there are several outlets that do write about these issues, but often from like a very obvious political perspective. And although I have a political perspective and I will write about it, as a magazine, we will publish a communist. If you write a good article and you make a case, even if you argue that Bo Winegard's view on human variation is wrong, 100% wrong.
Yeah.
If you write a good article on that, I would be happy. I would be thrilled to publish that. And that's what we want to do. We want to have cordial, but strident at times, if those aren't conflicting, intense debate and about these topics that are incendiary, because they're important. Like, for example, I think human variation may be one of the more important intellectual topics, but demographic change may be one of the more important political topics. And
Yeah.
there are very few places write openly about that issue. Now, Matt is a little more interested in other things such as embryo selection or something, or dysgenics. I'm not as interested in those topics, but I think they're important, and then he handles those more than I would.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a few different things. There's sort of the interest in human variation. It sounds like immigration is another topic, and then human reproduction. All three of which are kind of like taboo, essentially.
Yes.
And that's sort of the thorough line for the issues of focus, right? Is that kind of in the current academic climate, academic environment, there's a lot of questions about these things that you're not even really allowed to ask. And then B, if you want to study them at all, you have to sort of take a predetermined position in terms of your research orientation in the first place. Like, you have to sort of go looking for an answer rather than actually
I would
asking
say
you
have the answer already. You have to look for evidence to get to your answer in today's world, right?
Work
I
backwards.
think that's, exactly.
Okay. So, and you said, though, that it's not really, so it's non-political in terms of, like, its focus is not on culture war issues or whatever's in the headlines necessarily. But obviously the staff has their own political positions that they may or may not take in their pieces. And then you're willing to publish people of differing ideologies as long as they can make a good argument. And is it really, the focus is really on the debate itself, not necessarily putting out scientific findings? Is that correct?
No, I would say it's both. And as far as about the debate, what I would say is I don't know that it's about the debate per se, but rather that I think it's important to have the debate. And I want to illustrate, and so does Matt, and I know Noah also agrees with this. We all think that the important thing about these issues, of course, I have my views and I'll argue for them. But the important thing about these issues, as you said, is like they're not debated honestly in academia. So in fact, like, for example, if you hold many of these views in academia, you don't even have to forward an argument because everybody agrees with you. So what I would like is for the people, like, let's suppose that now there are, like, take immigration. There are some people who argue intelligently and reasonably for much more generous or open immigration policies. Brian Kaplan's a great example. Yeah. Now, I think Brian Kaplan,
a number of George Mason faculty.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, or Cato people who work at Cato. My view is I'm happy for those people, because even though I disagree with them, in fact, I disagree with them vehemently, they're willing to have a debate that is a very important debate. And I would prefer to interact with somebody who champions the exact opposite view from me. I would rather interact with that person if he or she can debate with me than I would interact with somebody who largely agrees with me but won't debate with me. So that's what I think is important. But I don't want to say it's about the debate, though. I mean, it is about, look, like, we have certain ideas that we think are correct that we would like to put out in the world, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's precisely because I think these ideas are correct and can withstand debate that I also think we should debate them.
And what do you say to people who might argue that this uh like rhetorical positioning is a kind of attempt at, let's say, right wing um uh victim sort of politics? I hear this a lot, that like when people pretty much almost always on the right are
Mhm,
saying that their ideas are not being heard or they're not
mhm.
being propagated in academia,
Right.
usually like the first objection is, well, of course they're not, because they're morally and factually incorrect. But once you
Right.
get past that, the next thing that they say, and you'll even see other people on the right levy this critique,
Mhm.
is you're playing victim politics. You're trying to
Right.
use your victimization as an opportunity to gain the upper hand in a moral argument.
Mhm.
And people will say this about, various kinds of like white identity, issues and things like that. That like you
Yes.
shouldn't be adopting the victim frame, because
Right.
that in itself is like an inherently kind of left-wing frame. What's your response to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated, my attitude toward that is complicated because I think that there's at least a kernel of truth to that criticism, right? Like it is, I think as humans, we're all vulnerable to playing the victim, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I just think like in our moral stories in our head, we are either the hero or the victim. And if we're not the hero, it's because we're the victim of some iniquitous forces who are holding us back, right?
Right.
Why am I not as successful as other people? It must be that there's some conspiracy against me and my views.
Well, and we're deeply fragile creatures. We actually are
Yes,
vulnerable.
absolutely.
So
Yeah. Oh,
we
yeah,
will all at
absolutely.
some point be victimized,
You're
right?
right. That's a good point. Fair, very fair point. Is that like we do get victimized. Like human life is exploitation and victimization. You're right.
Some of it.
But but I think the important thing is, on the one hand, if you really are the victim of some kind of suppression, censorship, etc., that's one thing, and you should call that out and draw attention to it.
Yeah.
I think we should resist too easily or too rapidly declaring that we've been the victim of something. So I'll just give you a concrete example. I remember I worked with these co-authors on this article, and we got rejected. And I remember talking to them, and I immediately said, of course, this is unfair. They were biased. Look at these reviews. There's not even a patina of fairness here. And one of the co-authors said, look, like, we can spend our time grousing about this, or we can try to make the article better and get it somewhere else. And I thought, yeah, that's a healthy attitude. Like maybe I want to go have 2 drinks and whine about it, and maybe we should be able to do that. But it is true that like you want to work hard and get the ideas out there and not fall prey to too excessive of a victim mentality. So I think that's a fair criticism. I guess what I would say though about let's say my complaints about academia or Aporia's complaints about academia and mainstream discourse, I think they're just factually correct. I mean, I
Mm.
can't help it that it happens to be the case that academia, especially in the social sciences, is dominated by, is teeming with progressives who have no qualms about suppressing information which challenges their sacred values. And I think the same is true of mainstream media, even, by the way, mainstream conservative media, say the National Review. I'm a happy reader of the National Review. I
I'm
read it
not.
every day. Okay, fair enough. I don't blame you. I do. I read it every day. I like to see what they're writing about and what their opinions are, and I listen to their podcast. But
Mm.
there is, they obviously avoid certain issues, and the issues that they do talk about that are peripherally related to these taboo topics, they do so quite strategically. I think that's just a fact. I don't think we're you know ululating about being victims unfairly in this case, because it just is a fact that the mainstream they do not talk about these issues. And I guess what I would say is the fact that I get emails from people who tell me they love what we're doing and they love my article because they can't find this elsewhere suggests that my view of this is correct, or at least other people share this view that they can't get these things from the mainstream.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my take on this is just like, I will occasionally notice some of my people I follow on Twitter or mutuals even getting like really black-pilled about things, to use the doomer terminology.
Yes.
And doing a lot of complaining, and I'm just like, look, I think this is ultimately like very demoralizing to do. And so you should avoid doing it. I mean, yes, it's true that there are going to be hypocritical actions taken, right, by those in power. What's the Moldbug refrain? It's like the strong do what they must. Or sorry, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must.
Yeah, that's
right?
from Thucydides.
Yeah, right. I didn't know that, but so this is just a fact of like political life, that there is power, and if you are not in power, then you are a subject, and you are going to be dominated at times unfairly. That being said, I just think it's a it's a ressentiment, like encouraging like position to take. And you don't want to fall into like any kind of trap of psychologically being like habituated to victim thinking. And really all there is to do is to like do the work and do good work and wait, right? And maybe your reward won't actually come. Like I think that's a part of fate that people who have not like struggled in a long time need to like remember, is that sometimes you just lose for a really long time, and you have to still act. You still have to act virtuously despite the fact, because the only way you win eventually is by acting in accordance with virtue.
That was so placidly, maturely, and soberly spoken that I want to give that credit. And that is the attitude that I aim for. I cannot say I am always living up to my Senecan or Marcus Aurelius type standards. But I think an important thing you noted there was, so the ressentiment, I think, is important because it is easy to be overcome with bitterness and to start hating people in a way that is, not only is it toxic to the sort of political discourse, but it's toxic to yourself, honestly. Like it just like blackens you. But also, sometimes you just lose. Right? I think that's important. I say this to people. I say, look, like a lot of my political preferences have already lost, and I'm fully aware of that, and I've accepted that. And I can't like hate the world because it didn't give me the political system that I ideally would like. Right? Like when I get in the mood where it starts to cause me, it starts to really like rankle me, then I go out and I look at birds and the weather and I read romantic poetry and I feel a bit better and I get more level-headed. And I do agree with you too. I think you're exactly right. You just, again, to be fair, I'm sure I will complain about things and people can smack me in the head for whining or something. But in general, I totally agree with you. And you just have to do the work. You have to put the ideas out there. And that's why, by the way, that's like another reason I love what we're doing at Aporia, because I'm just putting the stuff out there. Like, okay, look, like I can sit around and harass academics forever. What is that going to accomplish? Now I'm actually writing articles, I'm putting them out there, and I'm trying to persuade people.
Yeah. I mean, my orientation towards the world is that there is a true reality out there, and the world, like the fact that it manifests before us means that all of it like compiles at some level, which means that there can't be contradictions. And the absence of contradictions, of true contradictions. Now, there might be a lot of apparent contradictions, and we're partial creatures, and we're limited by our perception and everything else. But the absence of true contradictions means that if you are professing true things, that they will inevitably come to the surface. Now, again,
Oh,
that
I'm a
doesn't mean
little
you're going to reap your rewards.
right.
I think in America, especially, we have this idea of like, you need to be winning all the time. You must never be a loser. Your income
Right.
must never go down. You must never have any,
Right.
troublesome periods in your career.
Right.
And it just should just be this like steady upward trend your entire life. And the truth is that, like, if you want to do something like really important and really meaningful, that a lot of people disagree with,
Yes.
that's not going to be your life.
Yeah, absolutely. I
And
could not agree with you more. That is 100% right. Although let me interject just to
No,
point
go ahead.
out, I'm definitely a little more morose than you are, because I think that I'm not so optimistic about the like the eschatology you paint you laid out there, because I don't know that truth ultimately prevails. I think truth it's an annoyance, right? It's I think Colin Wright said it's like a thorn in the foot of an ideology that's wrong. Like it's always there and it's annoying, and they have to kind of cover it up and like put a band-aid over it or whatever. But I think the history of humans makes pretty clear the fact that truth does not prevail. And that's just how it is. That
Yeah.
that is just how it is. And I don't, because I
Well,
think you're
in a
right.
cosmic sense, it does, but maybe in a human, like anthropologically, it does not
Yeah, okay,
necessarily,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's
So
like
anthropologically,
how many truths uh, have died in the head of the speaker,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Great point. And further, another thing, and this is something, this is, it's sort of taking this from Nietzsche, but and this is one of the things I think is the most tragic about human beings, is that you can be willing to die for something that's wrong.
Mhm.
Passion of belief does not bear a correspondence to reality.
Right, right.
People have had passionate beliefs about absolutely risible ideas and have died for them. So that's just how it goes. But I
People
do.
die for democracy. People are dying for democracy right now.
Are you a integralist?
I'm not an integralist, no, but
Okay.
uh, yeah, I have qualms with democracy.
I do too, but that's like a whole, yeah, that's a 3 hour
Yeah,
lovely podcast, but different one. Yeah.
right. Yes, yes. Different show. Okay, so I guess we've kind of gone along a more philosophical bent about the nature of truth and justice, and whether you get your just desserts for speaking the truth and being truthful.
Yes.
I've at least personally found that like I was in a position earlier this year where I was like kind of deciding whether like I was going to get back into podcasting again, whether I wanted to like um I was wavering on presenting myself online under my own identity.
Mhm.
And I had a pseudonymous Twitter account. And I had some conversations with some people about it, people who are anonymous, people who are not anonymous. And my decision was basically, I was convinced by the argument that if you come out as you really are, um, and you present to the world um, in an authentic way, then yeah, you are going to be potentially punished for doing so. Like there are
Mhm.
going to be avenues and doors that are closed to you that
Yeah.
people who are more cowardly and unwilling to say what they mean under their true name
Mhm.
uh, will have that optionality preserved.
Right.
But the upside is that you actually get to surround yourself with the people that like know what you think
Yes.
and actually like agree with you, or at least are willing
Yes.
to tolerate you.
Exactly.
um
Yeah.
and I found that I don't want to be like overly wistful about this, but I have found that uh it is the best way to sort of end up in a place where you would like to be,
Yes.
because a lot of people I know are hiding what they actually think, and
Mhm.
they're in places that they don't want to be, um, where they can't speak freely, where their friends don't even know what they actually believe politically or otherwise, and they're just like trapped in this like cocoon that they've created for themselves because they're unwilling to take the risk and deal with the pain of rejection, of losing a job potentially, whatever might entail. I mean, there is real financial loss, there is
Yeah.
real career
Yeah.
damage that happens as a result of deciding to like be a public person. And not everybody needs to be a public person, but
Right.
if you are going to say things in public, and you feel the need to do so,
Mhm.
then it's just I think it's just an assessment of like, okay, what kind of life do you want to live? And my conclusion was that the more you hide, the more you become a thing that hides, and a thing that hides
Mhm.
is detestable.
So I largely share I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to what you said there. And in fact, I mean, people may find this surprising, but one of my intellectual heroes, at least in my 20s, was Noam Chomsky. And I actually did take this lesson from him, although obviously he would abhor my views because,
You
they
are an
were
imperialist. No, yeah.
exactly, exactly. But he said it's about looking yourself in the mirror in the morning, and I do feel that way. When
Mhm.
you're right. I've lost literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? But and now again, I do want to be clear. I'm lucky. I understand that, so I'm not trying to complain about that. I'm just being honest. There is a cost to that, but you're absolutely correct that if you are honest about your views, you don't have to remember what you said privately. That's what I like to say. Like, I
Yeah.
don't want to be a person who's constantly cowering in the corner thinking, I hope nobody tells the public what I said, what my real views are. And I know a lot of these people. I knew them in academia. In fact, it's one of the most disconcerting things about being in academia. It was just witnessing the utter cowardice of these professors who would tell me one thing privately and do completely, and espouse completely different views publicly.
Mhm.
And I imagine they were, rather trepidatious about being honest with people privately, even because they were always afraid of getting, like, having those secrets, as it were, secrets divulged. Also, they were just constantly anxious that they would be anyway, and
Mhm.
that's not a way to live, in my view. My view is, you're exactly right. You state your views clearly, charitably, and honestly publicly, to the best of your ability, admitting that you could always be wrong and being willing to update those views. And then the people, and as I think it's important, as you said, it's not just people who agree with you, it's also people who can tolerate your views. So I don't have a lot of friends, I wouldn't say, but I have a lot of people I talk to, and many of them disagree with me strenuously about these issues, but at least I know they're willing to have the debate and they're not going to throw me under the bus publicly.
Right, right. Yeah, and like yeah, I've observed that too. I wouldn't say that you necessarily can like trust everyone who will tolerate you, but you at least know that like they're not afraid of you, or like they don't have some sort
Right.
of weird like sneaking suspicion about you. Um
Yeah, that you're like, you secretly have some nefarious, like,
yeah,
you're some nefarious being who has some, wicked designs on the world.
right, right, right.
Yeah,
So that's comforting, I guess.
it is.
So who are some of the other academics? There's obviously yourself, there's Noah Carl, the other
Hmm.
members of the team. Who are
Hmm.
some of the other academics that have sort of started to find a bit of a home at Aporia? And um, yeah, that would be my first question. And then the
Hmm.
second, there's sort of a additional question attached to that, which is, um, have any people that are currently in academia, not like ex-academics or exiled academics, or um, you know, would-be academics who had to go into the private sector, are there any people in academia who've used Aporia as just a more open platform to write some stuff that maybe they'd have a hard time getting somewhere else?
Yes, and I would say people have done that. some people have probably used pseudonyms, so I actually don't want to go too much into
Oh, of
that.
course, we're
Just
not going to
yeah.
divulge anyone's
Oh,
identity.
right. No, I know you're not trying to you're not trying to get that out of me, but I just the reason for my reticence there is precisely because I want those people to do so when they want to.
Mhm.
But yes, there some academics, and we've had wonderful interviews on podcasts with
Yes.
everybody from Brian Kaplan to Louise Perry to Paul Bloom. So some David Geary, I interviewed, Toby Young, just very interesting people on the podcast. And I think probably people feel more comfortable with a podcast than with writing an article because they feel as though it's a little bit more distant from your brand and it's just like an hour and a half conversation. But there are some academics who are probably going to write for us in the future. And I would say I've actually, so I would say I'm naturally, as I said, a little more morose, pessimistic perhaps, but I've actually become optimistic about what's happening in the past 5 to 10 months. I really do think there's an opening. Maybe part of that's because Elon has Twitter and that's allowed discourse to expand there.
Mm.
But I also think there's a lot of pent up rage against the overreach of wokeism. I think a lot of people are fed up with it. And maybe even interestingly, the overreach of trans issues. I think what that causes is people to become skeptical of the status quo, to become dubious of things that experts claim, because you have people claiming men can get pregnant, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, wait a second, what? This is, transparent balderdash. If these people are wrong about this, maybe they're wrong about these other things. And
Yeah, sort of
maybe
like a mass Gelman amnesia.
yeah, like maybe the moral fervor with which they were attacking these other views is actually hollow, and behind it there is no truth. And I was wrong for thinking, oh yeah, these people must be racist if they would challenge this, or they must be sexist if they would challenge this. So I think because of that, discourse is opening up a bit. And the things that we've been writing about, I think some academics will start writing, and that's my hope.
Yeah.
Now, I can't, it's hard because at the same time the discourse is opening up on Twitter, and maybe things are becoming a little more. Maybe they're moving slowly toward the free speech side there. I think academia might be purifying itself precisely by boiling out, as it were.
Well, I think academia is actually making itself basically less relevant to at least
Yes.
the cultural discourse.
Yes, right. Especially the social sciences, right? I always think
Mm.
it's important to, because like, look, like they're doing great things in physics and chemistry and even genetics, like as long as they're not talking about like, race, right? They have a lot of euphemisms, etc. But the social sciences, I think you're exactly right. They're becoming less relevant to public discourse because they're so obviously partisan, and people have recognized that. Especially, another thing I didn't mention was the COVID thing. Like,
Yeah.
I'm so tired of that discourse, but I do think it's true that expert overreach once again and promoting transparent nonsense caused a backlash, and people are now just more skeptical of quote unquote experts.
So yeah, I mean, I agree that it does feel as if as if like the vibe has shifted, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But I and yeah, it seems to me like just like normal people, not like people who are too online or like internet radicals or people that are part of like fringe political ideologies, which is a lot of my friends.
Mm-hmm.
It does feel to me like a lot of just like normal people who are not that political, either way, are getting like kind of like tired of this stuff.
Yes.
And there does seem to be a groundswell of like, I don't know if it's rage per se, but at least like frustration.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And yeah, and you know, this is remarked upon like quite often, but like one of the like results of this is that like anyone who's outside of like the mainstream on like really anything, whether it's, and sometimes it's just one topic. Like I know a guy who's like a pretty hardcore partisan Democrat, like a very cynical person. I don't actually like this individual very much, but they are like not down on the party line on trans issues, right? Like they have kids, and they just like don't believe it, and they think it's
Right.
wrong. And even just like one or two issues that where you deviate from the party line basically puts you in a camp with like a bunch of right wingers. Like
Yeah,
I know another
exactly.
guy who's
Yeah.
like literally a lifelong Democratic operative. Okay. He worked in polling for Democrats. I won't reveal more information about who this may or may not be. Who basically spends all of his time now talking to people that are like on the right because
Right.
because those are the only people he can talk to about his like skepticism. Not even like he's
Yes.
made up his mind, but he's like skeptical about certain things, and he's just discovered that he like cannot talk to any of his political allies about it.
Yeah, and I think that the important thing with that is there are those issues, those sort of sacred issues, from which if you dissent, the left will crush you, right?
Yeah.
They don't have any mercy for you. And at that point, what happens to that individual is they naturally, because we want to talk to people who are tolerant of us, they start talking to people who will listen to them. And I'm like, oh, great, I'll listen to you on that. And then they're more likely to listen to that, you know, they think, okay, maybe the same thing that happened to me on, say, trans issues is what happened on race. Like maybe it was you know, like a excessive moral response, and maybe there's some truth to these things, and maybe I should just listen to this at least. I think that actually happens a lot. And you were saying, it reminds me of definitely people I know who are have been voted Democrat literally every time they've ever voted. You know, they're professors at small, reasonable universities, and they're just rage. Yeah, rage. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but they're fed up with it. They're tired of it. They're tired of everybody kowtowing to this ideology, and they consequently they become much more open to right wing views on other topics. And yeah, so I'm a little bit hopeful about this. Now, I don't have any illusions about it. I think we're just going to be a very polarized country, and a lot of these issues, like you and I will be able to talk about it, and then some progressive will think we're terrible human beings, and that's just how it's going to be.
Yeah. So I want to sort of get out of the culture war focus, just because like this show is itself also similar to Aporia. It's not an explicitly political show. We don't have a ideological axe to grind.
Right.
Although I have my own views, and people can infer what those may or may not be. So I guess one sort of question that I think lies at the center of what it is that you're trying to do with Aporia, and is tied in more broadly with like just general themes of governance and what is the best regime, and you know, striving towards the good, and so forth, that goes all the way back to Plato's Republic, is this question of open epistemology, and whether improving our epistemology necessarily implies improvement of society, or if in fact there are certain truths, let's say notable lies, right?
Yes.
That should not be revealed, and therefore it would be better if we don't reveal them.
Yes.
One example of this that's like that so I have this theory about George Soros and what he's doing with the Open Society Project, which is like based on the fact that like his whole foundation and his theory of finance and politics is heavily influenced by Karl Popper's work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, right? And The Open Society and Its Enemies makes the argument that science needs to not be too politicized, because if you start politicizing science, you then close off the flow of information, and you want free flow of information to get to the truth, okay? if I take this framework and I put myself, if I'm trying to imagine what it is that's driving George Soros, and I say, okay, I'm not going to just accept the framing that he's an evil cartoon villain who hates the world, although it's hard for me not to. If I say that I want to figure out why this guy thinks that what he's doing is good, one argument that I could come up with is that a lot of what the Open Society is doing is like stress testing, let's say the United States, let's say the judicial system or the prosecutorial system of the United States. And therefore he's just like, it's an almost left-wing accelerationism where you dramatically increase the flow of information in the system so that you can find the weak points, and you keep like poking at the weak points and exploiting them over and over again until the system fixes itself. In that vein of thought, sorry, I wanted to just sort of like,
no, that's okay,
get that idea
out.
Absolutely. Are there things that you think are not worth exposing? What is your view on sort of like radical open epistemology?
I think this is one of the most difficult and fascinating questions with which I have wrestled for many years, and I still don't have a strong belief about it. So to be clear, if you go back to Plato in the Republic, well, at least through Socrates, but we can assume Socrates is standing in for Plato. Socrates propounds the view that we should maybe promulgate noble lies a couple of times about the metals and the hierarchy being associated with more noble metal, as it
Not
were.
only that, the stories that are told to children, the music you can listen to, there's a heavy amount of censorship involved.
Very so, but okay, so like we could distinguish between lies and censorship, right? So yes, definitely
lies by omission, right?
Yeah, exactly. Lies by omission and lies by explicit like commission. I mean, because at one point he advocates for eugenics via a lie that there will be this fake lottery that puts people together.
Right.
So I wouldn't endorse that, certainly. But the censorship thing, Plato was, he's a brilliant stylist himself, probably could have been a great dramatist. And so he recognizes the power of art, and he was quite worried about it. So I think like it's easy to dismiss Plato, right? Because, look, we live in a much more affluent and safe society than Plato did, right? Plato lived at a time when war was not only an ever-present danger, but you could die in that. Like, war is common now, but for most people, it's just something they have to imagine because they're not actually going to be on the front line. So I think it's, I'm rather tolerant of Plato's views, and I think, it's a different time. He's thinking about these things seriously, and he's attempting to grapple with the most difficult issues that political philosophers can grapple with. So obviously I wouldn't endorse the kind of censorship Plato would endorse. Do I think that there are some truths that are so divisive or so, I don't know, like undermining of the social fabric that you probably shouldn't attempt to spread them? Yeah, I think there might be truths like that. I honestly do. I haven't come up with one that's an obvious target for that category that I would definitely say, yes, this truth is just, it's so pernicious that if it were ever widely believed, society would fall apart. But I do think it's reasonable to think maybe there are some ideas that you should keep within a tiny group of people and debate them, and you can handle those. And I know that sounds unapologetically elitist. I'm open to the evidence. I am. I don't have a good answer here, and I've wrestled with this for a long time.
And it is, and we are unapologetic.
Yeah. I mean, because here's a theory. I'll lay this theory out. So I think it is actually the case that there are different let's call them channels or domains of discourse, and they have different standards and expectations. And that one of the things that led to the great awakening in the academy is the fact that discourse now would leak out of the academic domain and into the public domain. So I'll give you a concrete example. In a lot of philosophy classes, it's like the ethics classes, you would do these thought experiments that many people would consider grotesque and shocking. Like,
Right.
Well, what if you gave the person a drug and then somebody had sex with the person, but they didn't know it? Okay. And you can see where it goes from there. It's like challenging utilitarianism. In a philosophy classroom, an ethics classroom, I think you should be allowed to have that thought, you should play that thought experiment out and have robust debate about it. But you can see what happens if one student records the professor saying that and then goes and puts it on Twitter, and now a 40-year-old mother who doesn't understand why would you be doing such a perverted thought experiment, she gets a hold of it, and then she retweets it and is like, what is this vile filth they're teaching in philosophy? And then it goes viral, right? Because it's like a different domain of discourse. This is not the thought experiment that you would call your mother and say, hey, I've got this cool thought experiment, let's talk about it, right? So there are different domains of discourse, and they have different rules and expectations. And I think when they contaminate each other, they actually, like, the rules of one start to bleed over into the rules of another. And maybe that suggests that we should be a little bit cautious with some things that, like, we as philosophers might like to talk about, but you don't need to talk about them on CNN or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's oddly enough often a defense that's given for something like critical theory, right? So like critical theory comes out of critical legal studies. It was supposed to be this sort of like very abstract legal theoretical model, intersectionality and all of that stuff. It was taught in like law schools in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's like, when you talk about how there are different domains, maybe it shouldn't be taught to like, and like, you can argue about the validity of the theory itself and whether it should be taught in law at all. But
right,
like, independent of that, like, maybe it shouldn't be taught to your kindergartner. Like, maybe it's not a good idea to start talking about critical race theory to a bunch of 12-year-olds, or even honestly a lot of undergrads. It may not have the framing, and also at this point, obviously these ideas develop, they're sort of like viruses, they kind of evolve, they take on new forms. What it often gets presented as is not really what it was like originally. Like, you can go back and read the foundational papers for a lot of these ideas, intersectionality, critical theory, etc., and the like dumbed down, like, college freshman introductory version of it is like really nothing like that often.
Right. It's a much more fatuous version, I would say. And yeah, like, so what do you think about, I mean, because I would even make the argument that I would keep race out of K through 12. I don't think that's a free speech issue either. I see people, David French and Chatterton Williams, and there was another author on the piece. They wrote, I think it was in the Atlantic, it might have been the New York Times, like a piece defending, CRT in school on a free speech basis. But look, what would happen? We know what would happen if a 5th grade teacher taught the bell curve. That teacher would be fired in minutes, right? I mean, it would be remorseless termination. Same thing if somebody taught Rushton's race, evolution, and behavior. And the reason is, like, K through 12, like, look, I think they can engage in dialectic, obviously. You can have some debate on things when you're in K through 12, but mostly what you're attempting to do is develop like fundamental skills, like mathematical skills, reading skills, etc. You're not debating the most controversial and intractable problems known to humans. So I'm willing to just say, look, like, you get into college, it's a different game. I'd be, expose them to all kinds of ideas. And then look, if you don't like the ideas that one college teaches, go to a different college. But K through 12, I'm much more open to like Chris Rufo's arguments that we should just get CRT out.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think it's like terribly divisive. It causes all kinds of weird dynamics among the children. And often it's just like a way for the teachers, whatever. We don't need to go harp on this. I think everyone listening probably knows roughly what we think about it.
But the question is a more abstract one and not it's political, but it's not partisan, which is this open epistemology. It's a very fascinating thing to think about. And
what you're describing is a sort of like gated epistemology, where
a republic, I would call it, right? Like that's how I think.
Yes.
Right. It's like, it's not
if you can keep
democracy. Yeah, exactly. If you can keep it. And the way you keep it is you have like filtering systems. Now, again, importantly, that doesn't mean you use the like sort of iron hand of the law to squash ideas or something. I mean, I think mostly what happens, the way you maintain these domains and the way that they I don't want to say they're completely autonomous, because obviously they interact with each other, but the way they remain separate is mostly through social norms, which is, I think you should use social norms when you can, because obviously the law it's important.
Well, it's too costly. It's too costly to use the law everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And enforcement's costly. And also law is inevitably dumb because it can't make exceptions, because once you start making exceptions with the law, you undermine the law. So I would say
it's a law.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, great. I think we've left people with a lot of interesting things to mull over for themselves. Obviously, we're not going to get to the bottom of a lot of these questions here today. Bo, it was great speaking to you once again. I'm glad to have you back on. I'm glad to see that you're doing well with Aporia. Before we head out, where can people find you? Where can people find you, and also more about the magazine?
They can find me on Twitter. I don't remember my Twitter handle, so I apologize for that. You can put it up if we find
it'll be in the notes. All this will be in the notes.
But if you search my name, you will find me, and then you will find links to the magazine. And I would just I have a couple long pieces there. I would ask readers, or I'm sorry, listeners, if they're curious, please read those pieces. I think it represents the best of what we're trying to do.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you so much, and see you guys later.